It was a warm Saturday morning when 8-year-old Liam Thompson arrived at the local soccer field with his dad, Mark. The sun was shining, and the grassy field buzzed with excited voices and bouncing soccer balls. Liam wore his red team tracksuit proudly. It had the town's crest sewn neatly on the chest, and he beamed as he joined his teammates for warm-ups. Mark watched from the sidelines with a smile, holding a coffee cup and chatting with a few other parents. Everything felt normal, peaceful, and routine. The boys were running drills. Coach Dan shouted encouragement from the field, and parents were spread out on foldable chairs, clapping for their children. But by the time the game ended, everything would change. When the final whistle blew, players rushed to the bench to grab water, high-five, and talk about the match. But Liam was not among them. At first, no one noticed. He wasn't the type to cause a fuss. Mark looked around, expecting Liam to be chatting with someone or tying his shoes behind the bench. But when minutes passed and he still didn't appear, Mark's stomach began to tighten. He walked up to Coach Dan, a gruff but friendly older man who led the team for years. "Hey, have you seen Liam?" Mark asked. Dan scratched his head and looked around. "He was just here," he said. "Maybe he went to the restroom?" Mark nodded and jogged toward the restroom building by the parking lot. He called out Liam's name, checked inside, but it was empty. He checked the snack stand. Nothing. Soon, other parents noticed Mark pacing and joined in the search. 10 minutes later, panic set in. Liam's bag was still by the bench. His water bottle and jacket were untouched. It was as if he had simply disappeared between the final whistle and the team gathering. Within an hour, the police arrived. They taped off the area and asked questions. Dogs were brought in to sniff for Liam's scent. The field, locker rooms, nearby woods, and even cars in the parking lot were searched. Nothing. No scream, no struggle, no sign. Liam was just gone. The town was shocked. Flyers with Liam's smiling face were put up everywhere. News crews came, and volunteers searched every inch of surrounding areas. Mark and his wife, Laura, didn't sleep for weeks. They couldn't understand how their happy, careful son had vanished in plain sight at a public soccer game. Coach Dan was questioned several times. He had been coaching for over 20 years and was known in the community. He said he last saw Liam running to the edge of the field after the game. Police checked his background, his house, and his locker at the sports facility. Nothing suspicious was found. Mark tried to stay strong, but the days turned to weeks and then months. Birthdays passed without candles. Liam's room remained untouched. Laura cried often, while Mark tried to keep hope alive. He went to every possible sighting. Every phone call that sounded promising, but none ever led to Liam. After a year, most people moved on. But Mark never did. Something in his gut told him that the answer was closer than anyone believed. Over the next 3 years, Mark became obsessed. He made his own timelines, drew maps, and tracked who was where that day. He interviewed other kids and parents. He even took security training to learn how to investigate better. His marriage suffered, but he couldn't let go. And then, for years after that terrible day, something happened that pulled all the pieces together. A janitor at the sports facility where the team had once practiced found an old key wedged behind a loose tile near the lockers. It looked strange, worn and old-fashioned. Curious, he reported it to the facility manager, who didn't think much of it. But Mark, who had been quietly watching every detail of the case, found out. He asked to see the key. When he did, his heart skipped a beat. He had seen this key before, in Coach Dan's hand the morning Liam disappeared. Mark stared at the key for a long time. His hands trembled slightly as he turned it over, feeling the cold metal against his fingers. Memories of that awful day came rushing back. The cheers of the crowd, Liam's bright smile, and the chilling moment when he realized his son was missing. He remembered Coach Dan unlocking a locker that morning before the game, using a similar key. At the time, it seemed normal. But now, after 4 years and no answers, every detail felt important. Mark went back to the sports facility and asked to see the lockers again. The manager was hesitant, but agreed, mostly because he felt sorry for the man who had never stopped looking for his son. The locker rooms had changed over the years, but a few of the old lockers remained. Some were jammed shut, rusted from lack of use. One stood out. It had always been Coach Dan's personal locker, used for storing equipment and coaching notes. Mark tried the key. It fit perfectly. He opened the locker slowly, his heart pounding. At first, it looked like any other locker. Sports jerseys, an old whistle, some notebooks. But then he noticed something strange. Behind a row of folded towels was a cardboard box taped shut. Mark pulled it out with shaking hands and peeled back the tape. Inside were photographs, drawings, and a red team jacket with the initials LT on the tag. Liam Thompson. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He pulled out one of the drawings. It was a child sketch of soccer field with stick figures and the word Dad written in large letters. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. How could this have been sitting in the coach's locker for 4 years? He reported the discovery to the police immediately. They sealed off the locker room and began a full investigation. Coach Dan was brought in for questioning once again, but this time things were different. The evidence was no longer circumstantial. The box had clearly belonged to Liam, and Dan had no reasonable explanation for why it was in his locker. He claimed he had no idea the box was there, that someone must have planted it. But the detectives weren't convinced. They examined the box for fingerprints and found multiple partial prints belonging to Dan, including on the tape used to seal it. Things started moving quickly after that. A judge granted a warrant to search Dan's home again, this time more thoroughly. At Dan's house, hidden in a locked cabinet in the basement, investigators found a collection of videotapes and journals. Some of the tapes had dates that matched soccer game days from 4 years ago. When the police reviewed them, they saw Dan had been secretly filming team practices and even following certain kids home, including Liam. The journals were worse. They contained notes about the players, who was quiet, who had what schedule, and chillingly, who was easy to approach. The evidence was overwhelming. Dan was arrested and charged with multiple crimes, including the abduction of Liam Thompson. The community was stunned. Parents who had once trusted him were now furious and heartbroken. How had they missed the signs? How had a trusted coach hidden such dark secrets in plain sight? For Mark, the discovery brought a mix of emotions. There was relief that something was finally happening, that someone was being held responsible. But there was also renewed pain. The red jacket, the drawings, these were signs that Liam had been somewhere after that game. He had possibly been alive for at least some time after he vanished. Mark clung to that possibility. The police began searching all properties linked to Dan, including a remote cabin he once used for team retreats. Hopes were high, but no sign of Liam was found there. Still, the search continued, more intense than ever before. Mark didn't stop. Now, more than ever, he believed his son was still out there, somewhere, and he was determined to find him. As days passed after Coach Dan's arrest, Mark felt like a heavy curtain had finally been lifted. For 4 long years, he had been fighting a silent battle against time, doubt, and despair. Now, with the truth starting to show, the pieces of the puzzle slowly came together. But even though Coach Dan had been caught and charged, Liam was still missing. That fact burned deeper than anything else. Mark met with the lead detective handling the case, a woman named Detective Harris. She had taken over the investigation after the initial years of little progress. She promised Mark that with the new evidence, they were now chasing down every lead. Dan's phone records, emails, old calendars, and storage rentals were being investigated. A new team was dedicated to reviewing all his activity from the months before and after Liam vanished. One of the phone records revealed regular contact with a man named Stephen Griggs, a former assistant coach who had left town suddenly 2 weeks after Liam disappeared. At the time, no one thought much of it. Stephen said he had a family emergency and relocated to a small town 2 states away. But now that his name was showing up in Coach Dan's private records, the detectives took notice. They contacted the authorities in that town and arranged for Stephen to be questioned. Mark wasn't allowed to attend the interrogation, but he waited at the police station the entire time, hoping for something, anything, that would lead him closer to his son. After hours of questioning, Stephen finally broke. At first, he claimed he didn't know anything, but when police showed him copies of the journals and his name highlighted in them, his story changed. He admitted that Coach Dan had asked for his help with keeping a kid quiet after a game, saying the boy had been snooping around the locker room. Stephen claimed he didn't know what Dan's real intentions were until it was too late. He said Dan had brought the child, Liam, to an abandoned barn outside of town and told Stephen to watch him while he figured things out. Stephen admitted to being scared and confused, but he stayed there for a night before Dan came back and moved the boy again. When asked where Dan had taken Liam, Stephen hesitated. Then he whispered something that made Mark's blood run cold. He said the boy was special. He said he had plans for him. Then he told me never to ask again. Stephen said he never saw Liam again after that. His story wasn't enough to bring Liam home. But it was something, a sign that Liam had survived at least that first night. The detectives pressed Stephen for details. Eventually, he remembered the barn's location. It had long been abandoned, but when police searched it, they found faint signs someone had once lived there. There were old wrappers, a child's shoe, and in the corner of the room, the initials LT carved into a wooden beam. It was a heartbreaking discovery. Mark visited the barn personally. He stood in the empty, dusty space and ran his fingers over the carved letters. He imagined his little boy, alone and scared, finding some small way to leave a mark, to say he had been there. It was almost too much to bear. Despite the pain, Mark found strength in the new trail. The police now believe that Dan may have passed Liam off to someone else, possibly part of something bigger than they first imagined. The idea that his son had been handed from one person to another terrified Mark, but it also gave him hope. If Liam had been important enough to keep alive and hidden, there was a chance he was still out there. Detective Harris agreed. She began working closely with federal investigators, suspecting this case could be part of a larger child trafficking ring. It was no longer just a local case. It had become a nationwide hunt. More agents joined the search, and with Stephen now in custody and talking, new leads appeared every day. Mark still carried Liam's red jacket in his car, folded neatly in the passenger seat. He touched it every morning before beginning another day of searching. He refused to give up. His son had left signs, and Mark was going to follow every single one, no matter how long it took. Weeks passed as Mark clung to every new clue the investigation uncovered. The search for Liam had become larger than he ever imagined. Now the FBI was involved, and old files from missing child cases across the country were being cross-referenced. Stephen Griggs was kept in custody under protection, and his information led to more discoveries. Police began searching through old storage units linked to Coach Dan. Units rented under fake names, some in towns no one knew he had visited. In one such unit, investigators found dozens of notebooks filled with symbols and codes. It became clear that Coach Dan had been involved in something dark and organized, not just a one-time crime. These new leads took the investigation places Mark never expected, across state lines and into a hidden world of people who traded in secrets and silence. But despite everything, Liam was still not found. Then one night, Mark received a call. It was from a woman in Arizona named Clara, who ran a recovery shelter for children who had escaped trafficking situations. She said a boy had recently been brought in by local authorities, one who fit Liam's age and appearance. The boy refused to give his name, but when shown a list of missing children, he had stopped at Liam's photo and stared at it for a long time. Clara wasn't sure, but she felt something. Mark's heart pounded. He didn't wait for police confirmation. He booked a flight and was on his way within hours, not knowing what he'd find. When he arrived at the shelter, Clara met him at the door and gently led him inside. In a quiet room, a boy sat with a blanket around his shoulders. His hair was a bit longer, and there were shadows under his eyes, but Mark knew the face. His breath caught. "Liam," he whispered. The boy looked up slowly. There was silence. Then his eyes filled with tears. "Dad," he said softly. Mark dropped to his knees, unable to speak. He wrapped his arms around his son, feeling his small frame, thinner than he remembered but real, alive. For a long time, they just held each other. After 4 long years, his boy was back. Liam had been taken by Dan and moved several times across state lines, passed from place to place. But somehow he had escaped. He had run when a door was left unlocked at a rundown house. He didn't remember every detail. Much it was a blur, but he remembered his name, his dad's voice, and the red jacket he had once worn. Those memories had kept him going. The shelter helped him until someone recognized his photo on a national alert and called Clara. Now he was safe. The reunion made headlines across the country. People who had followed the case from the beginning cried when they saw Mark and Liam together again. Coach Dan and Stephen were charged not just for Liam's abduction, but for being part of a much larger criminal network. More arrests followed as authorities uncovered the full extent of the group they were part of. It turned out Coach Dan had been scouting children for years, hiding in plain sight as a trusted community member. Liam's case helped bring down a ring that had remained hidden for far too long. Back home, Liam slowly adjusted. He was quiet at first, but Mark and Laura were patient. They didn't push him to talk about everything. They just surrounded him with love. His old room was just as he left it. His toys, books, and even a calendar frozen on the day he vanished were still there. Liam smiled when he saw it. He hugged his mom for a long time and told her he remembered her voice in his dreams. With therapy and care, Liam began to heal. And Mark, though forever changed by the ordeal, found peace knowing that his son was finally where he belonged. Sometimes, late at night, Mark would open the drawer where he kept a red jacket with Liam's initials stitched inside. It had once been the only thing left of his son. Now, it was a symbol of strength, proof that love and determination could lead to the truth, even when the whole world had given up. And though the scars would always remain, Mark knew one thing for certain. He never stopped believing, and that made all the difference.